Who wants to smoke with me? If I were to say that America has become two different countries in one, who would disagree? Most Americans would agree that America has become two different countries. So why do we fail to make the connection that if two different countries exist, then there are two different sets of Republican, Democratic, and independent vehicles aspiring towards either a democracy or a constitutional republic? And that's the truest binary in American politics today. It has nothing to do with red versus blue. It has everything to do with individual liberty versus universal equality, which also suggests you have a binary between who wants to live in a democracy or a constitutional republic. In simplified terms, this all asks, who's aspiring towards individual liberty where a constitution restrains government, or who's aspiring towards universal equality by a democracy where restraints are lifted off government? So what this does reveal is that red versus blue is a useless binary until Americans are actually aligned into the correct unions for the century. As we exist today, we aren't in the correct unions. I think that's proven by how Americans are not just disagreeing on life, liberty, and happiness. We disagree on what form of government we'll accept. So if at least 70 million Americans are aspiring towards democracy today, understand something. They're not just asking for a different form of government. They're asking for a different constitution. Democracy will always be where a constitution has less restraints on government, so government can distribute the equality it has promised. Whereas a constitutional republic keeps restraints on government, so individual liberty is preserved for the citizens' behalf. So the divide in America, summed up, it really boils down to who trusts the government when it promises to grant their wish. All it needs is just for you to lift those restraints off of it. Denying that this is the crux of America's problems is actually evil in 2025 and beyond. It's lethal and it's evil to ignore that 70 million Americans believe the government's promises that they would let the genie out of the bottle. Those circumstances are the problem of every single American today. America is showing symptoms that point to a disease, so Americans should ask themselves, what's America's disease? I'll tell you right now, it's an expired union. What are the symptoms of an expired union? It's a country that can't agree on what form of governance it has or what its constitution should restrain, the government or the citizen. The problem with that is, when a country questions what its constitution should restrain, that creates a divide that is actually lethal. The divide is what becomes home to tyrant classes to assert their agendas inside of. So if there's any truth to the saying that divided houses can't stand, then America actually needs to cure this divide in order to stand again. Americans have to confront the irony of our circumstances that do suggest that in order to conserve a constitution that restrains government, we must divide to solve the binary between who is asking for a democracy or a constitutional republic. We must divide to become sovereign economic wholes that have agreement on what our constitution should restrain. Our timeline calls for national realignment of states. If the divide between a constitutional republic and democracy isn't cured, tyrant classes will exploit this divide. It's happening right now. Tyrant classes only appear to citizens as beacons of hope and love and change and progress in the name of democracy, because when a country like ours loses agreement on what form of government it wants, where constitutional restraints are placed, then that country sends a signal to psychopaths, narcissists, and sociopaths with God complexes. So these agents literally arrive to our country not bearing fangs. They arrive as Power Rangers and Care Bears. They offer free stuff. It is because a country doesn't know where government's natural station should be that tyrants will be decisive for you when you're indecisive for yourself. America is just the perfect experiment that proves that societies will invert, feel upside down, where left becomes right, men will become women when an empire is falling, because it's lost consensus on what form of government it wants and where constitutional restraints are placed. Society becomes ripe for subversion, and it loses the ability to move towards any coordinated end in the event of a pandemic or biological warfare. Literally, America arrived to a place in time where members of oligarchies could mandate irreversible medical procedures because we've lost our way. And we have not solved the binary between who wants to live in a constitutional republic and who wants to live in a democracy. Now, the latter, democracy, sounds more savory until you realize democracy aspires towards universal equality, where human rights are promised. However, the price for those human rights are constitutional rights. So this claim can be backed up with proof and reality. The voter base that is the most hostile towards their own constitutional rights is what voter base? You answer that. Who can defend why they've outgrown the Constitution? Who can defend that free speech is dangerous? Whosoever this base is, they are overwhelmingly the base that aspires towards democracy. And that's not a coincidence. I do believe that since this is the case, it would be smart to put those independent Republican and Democratic vehicles that carry conservatives, progressives, liberals, libertarians, all of the above. Whoever aspires towards democracy, they need their own union. It is because democracy mandates universal equality, and universal equality requires that constitutional restraints are lifted off government so government can deliver what it has promised, that this is the case. Yet we still have to address that if that reasoning is followed, then we arrive at a problem where the agents of hope and change who endorse democracy, they're either intentionally or ignorantly omitting the conditions that democracy comes with. And this does beg, why should any of these people who are offering hope and change be trusted? If you don't understand that universal equality and individual liberty are fundamentally incompatible and therefore need separate unions for different constitutions in order to exercise different restraints, you have no business in politics. Not unless you know all of the above and you still peddle democracy anyway. America's circumstances in a nutshell require understanding that for Americans to blindly call this constitutional republic a democracy, certain facts had to be omitted about democracy's flaws, like how the American citizen will most definitely exchange their constitutional rights for human rights. However, since we're dealing with Americans who have more guns than blades of grass, I'll tell you this much: no government was flagrantly going to assault our constitutional rights. The long game was played instead. I do believe that it took one generation to sow the seeds of democracy, and then over time you'd have a voter base almost twice the size of Canada's census, defending how they'll trade their liberties for their own perceived safety. The secessionist posture on this issue is fine. If you consent to that trade, so be it. You should have it. States that consent to democracy should be released from the 50-state union to form their own union, where democracy can actually be concentrated in its own jurisdiction for the purpose of conserving the constitutional republic that America is. The critics of realigning into the correct unions for the 21st century may not understand the gravity of remaining in a union where a demographic of 70 million people acts not for just democratic processes, they're asking for democracy, which is a different form of government. These critics aren't looking at the American political system as if it was designed to transfer power to small interest groups. If they were, they'd make the connection that if interest groups in the 21st century are hostile to a constitutional republic, you've reached an unfortunate point in time where the mechanism designed to protect small interest groups from the majority, it's been cleverly weaponized to extents where the majority now need protection from the small interest groups who will assault the Constitution until this republic is no more. This is a hot take, but an America First president only buys Americans 4 more years of kicking a can down the road. When a population of 70 million, which for perspective is almost twice the size of Canada's census, chooses a different form of government that requires a different constitution, the answer isn't throwing an American First president at them. The answer must be yes. As you wish. As you wish is the answer when a country has a political pendulum swinging left to right before it gets stuck in one direction forever, because we've become so divided. There are 2 countries in one. So I don't believe it should be overlooked that if 2 countries exist, aspiring towards either democracy or a constitutional republic, that the truest binary that is worth addressing in America is not between red versus blue. We have to move past that. This is only a constitutional republic if you can keep it. The founding fathers seem to agree. If you resurrect them today, they'll ask the most patriotic American, why did you handcuff yourself to those who wanted out? Why didn't you conserve when cyclical and perpetual union splitting throughout time is how you keep America, America? Union splitting has to be in the DNA of this country. And that should lead everyone to the fountain of Texas versus White, where we explore these rulings that made it impossible for secession to occur. It's about that time, America. The deterrents that were once in place that stopped union splitting before don't apply today. Texas versus White must be revisited. And somehow, if the response to that is those in power won't let states leave, then somehow the deterrent still remains to be the catalyst. There must be a humanitarian, democratic, and political case for a national divorce made on behalf of Americans who are trying to avert political capture and being ushered into a genderless, technocratic form of governance that their children won't be able to vote themselves out of. The 2024 election, in a nutshell, showed that Americans don't want democracy, yet are willing to invigorate democratic processes somehow. Half of America's voter base sees that democracy has conditions attached that are worse than what it seeks to cure. And this was made obvious by those agents of change in identity politics who argued that since Western African slaves were denied reparations and betrayed by the American government, then the solution is to grow the same government progressively. The argument in itself suggests that something is very wrong with the people making it. Perhaps they are victims to varying degrees of subversion because somewhere in time, they were taught to reason to conclusions so bizarre that use the true history of an oppressed ethnic group's betrayal to substantiate growing the same government that betrayed them in the first place. You can't take arguments to their logical conclusions with a demographic that hates colonization yet accepts globalization. Something prevents this demographic of people from realizing that the colonizer comes in the name of letting no one keep their land. The globalist comes in the name of letting no one keep their hemisphere. They're evil cousins, but you have a problem with one. Something prevents the purveyors of democracy from realizing that nothing is moral or logical about using the true history of how this country was stolen to substantiate handing the country over to everybody, not the people it was stolen from. Somehow, the solutions that conservative liberals, libertarians, and progressives make who aspire towards democracy, it's always worse than the wrong they seek to right. And they don't see it. And that's what makes them dangerous. That's why people said no to democracy and progress. That's why your female Barack Obama didn't make it. Resolutions never seem to help, yet always grow government. Which is why, from a political science perspective, you can rid of red versus blue, replace it with democracy versus a constitutional republic, simplify that down to universal equality versus individual liberty, which, simplified again, means you're looking at positive freedom versus negative freedom. Those aspiring towards democracy endorse positive freedom, meaning this group aspires towards freedom and autonomy by keeping government in the positive, which leans into the case that for realigning into the correct union for the century, positive freedom orientations, meaning Republican, independent, and Democratic vehicles aspiring towards democracy, they're all diverse enough, yet compatible enough for the same union. Why? They're all diverse ideologically, yet they still have consensus on what government they want and what constitutional restraints they will accept. They also have consensus on where government's natural station should be. This demographic is already, technically, their own union. So it's time for America to start acting like it. Seeing things this way does dispel these misconceptions about national divorce and how national divorce seeks to put alike people in the same box. Contrarily, national divorce actually seeks to reinvigorate your elections, systems, and processes that have corroded to time, and most importantly, cure the divide between democracy and a constitutional republic, which has left room for tyrants to come in and tyrant. This divide has been left untreated, and if that continues, it will guarantee that America devolves proportionate to her census size. and America is about 350 million in census. She's a big girl. What America has on her hands requires separatism today. Separatism as a vehicle for peace. Democracy, not to be confused with democratic processes, requires its own union and constitutional restraints that restrain the citizen. So cure the divide between who wants to conserve a constitution that keeps a genie restrained or who wants the genie out of the bottle for democracy. Americans that consent to democracy, who agree to its terms and conditions, should be treated as consenting adults to be released from the 50-state union per their wish. They've built the scholarship and every defense that they have outgrown their constitutional rights. When a population of 70 million defends that they've outgrown the Constitution, they admit without admitting they've outgrown the 50-state union. Release them in this century, or the entire republic is lost to Father Time eventually. That foreshadows a political pendulum that is always swinging, that Americans can't afford to ignore anymore. You will always be up against Father Time. There is a fear that if this binary between a constitutional republic and a democracy isn't cured, then our children, they won't inherit the rights our ancestors slaved for, fought for, died for. Not if something isn't done in time. That is not only a case to make for national divorce, but there's also a case to rebrand it as a national realignment of states, because that's technically what you're doing. You're realigning into the correct unions for this century for the purpose of getting yourselves into the correct unions headed towards democracy or a constitutional republic. Surviving liberal and progressive indoctrination revealed as much. But that's another story.